All right, this is like my fifth take on this one. So let me see if I can get it right this time. This is your the first lecture that I'm giving on a reading. You're probably watching these in order, but it's okay if you're not. And so the rundown is on the right hand side here. These are the things that I want to hit in this lecture. I'm going to talk a little bit about some highlights from Clifford's reading that I want to make sure don't escape your attention. And I want to talk a little bit about the relation of this in the context with the other 9 readings and the course, about how this reading kind of fits in. But before I do that, I have a couple of kind of backgroundy things to talk about. And the first one is just a quick reminder that, of course, all of these videos are watchable through Perusall. That's where you're watching these. And I'm going to keep on encouraging you to use the add comment button to ask questions. Because I usually deliver these lectures to some variety of live audience, I love getting interrupted and having people ask questions about things. I'm not going to get interrupted here, and at the point that I'm recording this, I don't know how comments are going on the reading, so I kind of have to anticipate from past classes reactions to the papers that I assign, and anticipate where are the tricky points going to be. So some of the slides that I have for you today, where I'm going to discuss these highlights, are things that I think need emphasizing, because often I see students missing those points. But it's totally possible that this class is different and that different points are missed, or that there's questions that you have about the material that I haven't heard before. This is the place, besides the actual reading itself, this would be another place to kind of ask those follow-up questions, okay? Or if I give you new material here, this is the place for you to follow up on that stuff and ask follow-up questions for that. Okay, and the benefit is simply, in the short term, this is going to make you better prepared for the quiz that comes right after this in the module, and longer term, help adjust you better to the course as a whole and to attacking the other remaining readings more efficiently. Okay, so the first thing is that I'm anticipating in the Perusall comments is that this paper is going to be full of comments outraged about the behavior of the ship owner and those kinds of things. And I don't want to discourage most of those kind of posts, because they're increasing engagement. Classmates agree with one another and start having interesting conversations. But you might have noticed that at some points I kind of step in and try and gently redirect the conversation away from that stuff and tell people, okay, enough on this thread, move on, kind of thing. And that's because lots of the good thing about this paper is that it is engagingly written and has these colorful examples that get you talking. The bad part of that is that if you're talking about those kind of things, you probably aren't talking about the things I want you to talk about. So I'm going to try, lots of times I'm gently going to redirect you away from those tangents, even though they are interesting, even though they might actually count as philosophy. Talking about ethics, like this paper is talking about, is super interesting, but not for this course. So if you're super interested in the kinds of things that this paper was talking about, and these are the kinds of things you like to think about, then you might want to think about taking another philosophy course. Intro to Ethics, Introduction to Philosophy, or one of our upper level courses that talks super interesting stuff there. That's not what we're here for, though, with this reading. The thing that we're here for when it comes to ethics is to talk about the ethics of belief, about your responsibilities and obligations as a thinker, because Clifford has opinions on that, right? So the only real thing we need to know about ethics as background is that Clifford has a particular kind of viewpoint and attitude about ethics. There's a big discussion in ethics centered around whether or not when we decide whether an action is good or evil, good or bad, what we're paying attention to make that judgment. Are we paying attention to the outcome of a decision, or are we paying attention to the intentions behind the decision? Clifford is definitely an intentions matter type of person. The fancy word for that is a deontologist. He thinks that the thing that makes actions good or bad, the thing that makes anything good or bad, are the intentions behind it. In contrast, there are people who you might call results matter people. And they are people, the fancy word for that is consequentialism. They are people who say, you know what, it doesn't really matter what someone intended. What matters is what happened at the end. So, as an example, both of these two views can agree that Hitler was bad. Not a tough call, right? But they're going to make that judgment that Hitler was bad on what might sound initially like just a minor distinction, right? Clifford and other deontologists are going to say Hitler was bad because he intended the Holocaust. He intended to liquidate all of these undesirable people from Germany. He intended to wage war on the rest of the civilized world and take it over. All those bad things. That's what made Hitler bad. That's what makes him evil. He's always going to be evil because that's what he was intending to do. The consequentialists are going to agree, yeah, Hitler was bad, but not exactly for those reasons. The reasons why Hitler was bad is because, to a large extent, he succeeded in doing the things that he wished to do. He committed the Holocaust. He invaded multiple countries and was responsible for millions of deaths, tens of millions of deaths, right? That's what makes him bad. You might find it difficult to find a difference between those two things that I just said. So, to kind of clarify, I mean, most of the time, these two schools of thought, these two approaches to ethics, agree. They pass the same judgment on people 95, 99% of the time. There's only weird cases where they disagree. So I'm going to give you a weird case just so that you can see how different the two are. And then I'll shut up about this because it doesn't really matter for our purposes. Imagine an incompetent Hitler. A Hitler who intends to free Germany from the oppression of all of these despised groups, liquidate all these despised groups so that Germany now belongs as, you know, the land of the Aryan and all of that kind of stuff, and that he conquers the rest of Europe. He intends all that stuff, but he's useless. He is incompetent at doing it. So World War II kind of never starts because he never rises to, he's not as cunning, he's not as able to execute his plan. He never rises to power. World War II never starts. If that was the scenario, Clifford would still think Hitler was a deeply evil man. But the consequentialists would not. Right? They would just say, incompetent Hitler's not that bad. He's just now a garden variety racist. And hey, garden variety racists are bad because throughout their lives they make decisions that are racist, and that hurts people, and so that's bad. But Hitler's now just average racist evil. He's not, century caliber, top of the list evil guy, because he didn't do much, right? Clifford is still going to say, no, impressive amount of evil contained in that one guy, even though he wasn't able to execute this stuff, still matters, super evil guy, right? So the important thing to remember here is that this explains why Clifford is so angry with the ship owner. And why he still thinks that even if the ship somehow survived the trip, that it doesn't matter. Because Clifford's not a results guy. Clifford passes judgment on this ship owner because the ship owner deceived himself about the quality of the ship. And the fact that it survived, he said, the first version of the example, that the ship sank and that everybody died. He did that to elicit in you, the reader, some outrage, some drama, right? To make the example colorful. But for Clifford, he doesn't need the ship to sink. If he changes the scenario such that the ship luckily makes it across the ocean, he is still exactly as mad with the ship owner as he was before. And the same thing with the second scenario, right? In the second scenario, these people go around and accuse a bunch of people, put the town through grief for nothing, right? For Clifford, in that case, those people were wrong to do that. But if he changes the scenario so that they're accidentally correct, that they did recklessly go around and confuse people of, being Satanists or something like that. And then just by coincidence, they turn out to be right about that. Well, Clifford's going to say two things. One, he's going to say is, oh shit, they're Satanists. Let's take care of that issue, right? But the second thing he's going to say is, those people are still bad people. Because it doesn't matter that their beliefs turned out to be right. It's about how they formed them in the first place. And they did something deeply irresponsible and bad by doing that. And it doesn't matter that things turned out well in the end. Because this bad thing happened right then and there. And you can't erase it by having good things happen as a result. That doesn't count for Clifford. You can totally disagree with Clifford about that, by the way. You can be a consequentialist. You just have to appreciate that Clifford's not you, right? And if you're a consequentialist, there's still a version of the kinds of messages that he wants to talk about here that you're going to be able to take on board, right? Because the real thing for him there's three parts of his essay that I think are really crucial to figuring out and understanding his whole argument and why he's so mad with the ship owner and why he's so mad with anybody who does what the ship owner does, right? So the first one is that he's got what might be a kind of a peculiar idea of what a belief is. We ordinarily think, well, beliefs live in your head. And they stay in your head unless you choose to let them out, unless you choose to have those beliefs influence a decision. Clifford disagrees with that kind of attitude. He says, you don't have any beliefs in your head that purely stay trapped in your head and have no influence on your actions. Every belief you hold influences every action you take, even if it's just a wee little influence. That's maybe for all practical purposes undetectable. And the reason why he says that is because he thinks, look, if you truly believe something, right, then you've already, in a manner of speaking, acted upon it. And the action that you've taken has been to willingly accept that belief as one of yours, right? So the idea, what he said is, when you believe something and you haven't acted on it yet, if that belief is evil, if the actions it would ordinarily produce are evil, you're evil already, even if you haven't done that action, because you've committed, that you've approved of that belief, which will produce evil actions. You've approved of it. And that act we can hold you responsible for. And that act we can blame you for and say, you're a bad person, if we could find out what you believed, right? This is another crucial component that we're going to need to make sense of why Clifford feels so strongly about these people, right? And that has to do with his view about the role of education in society. So Clifford thinks that the main purpose of collecting knowledge, of acquiring knowledge, of filling libraries and universities with discoveries and stuff like that, is not the content, not the things that they have learned, but that the things that they have learned, the real value of those things is that they help the rest of us ask better questions in the future. That they train the rest of us about the value of asking questions. Look at how much it's produced. It's filled all these libraries with all sorts of discoveries and new knowledge and stuff like that. So we ought to value existing libraries, not for the knowledge that they hold, but because they give us the ability to fill more libraries with more stuff. That's Clifford's position here on education. Education, that's what education is supposed to do. Education is not supposed to fill our head with libraries. Our education is supposed to use the libraries to teach us to fill more libraries and to give us the ability to go out into the world and collect more information and learning and discoveries so that we can fill more libraries with it. And so that's why he thinks that just using libraries as these passive containers of human knowledge up till now, that is to be accepted without question, is a misuse and a warping, a corruption of real education. Because, and here's where he connects it into a society thing, he's saying, look, education, the libraries, all this stuff, it's not good enough that we've reached this point, right? Yes, people before us have contributed to society and built these libraries and filled them with knowledge and improved our lives. That's not the value of those libraries. The value of those libraries is as an object lesson, as an inspiration for us to do the same kind of thing and keep the momentum up, right? To do our part for society that will be inherited by our children and subsequent generations. That's what education is for, is to teach us to be able to fill new currently empty libraries. All right. Oh, character. Yes. The third thing that I think is worth highlighting in Clifford's view here, which we'll revisit this in subsequent readings, is that he's got a kind of an unusual idea about what character is. And how, and again, this revisits back to a couple slides ago where I was talking about how beliefs don't stay locked up in your head, right? For Clifford, right, no belief is insignificant, because even if we never act on them, if it was an evil belief, we've already committed it in our heart, right? We've already accepted it, which means we approve of that evil thing, so we should be held to account for that. But also, if we're sloppy with our beliefs, if we deliberately deceive ourselves about what's true, like the ship owner did, if we recklessly, on scant or no evidence, start to believe things we are not justified in believing, like the conspirators in the second example, then of course there's the content of those beliefs themselves is kind of objectionable, and the fact that they're false is the bad thing, right? But what Clifford's getting at here is that people who do that are making themselves worse in terms of their character, and that's going to have an impact on themselves and their future episodes of deciding to believe something, and also on society as a whole. Because he says no belief, no real belief, like a belief that you are prepared to act on and maybe you just haven't had the chance yet, no matter how trifling and fragmentary it may seem, it isn't insignificant because it prepares us to receive more of its like. That is, once you start believing this conspiracy theory because you're being a sloppy, reckless thinker, you're going to be more likely to believe other conspiracy theories or other wacky things, right? Believing that wacky thing that you don't really have a good reason to believe helps justify previous times that you have accepted stuff without really thinking it through, right? Because now that there's similar beliefs, and the more similar beliefs you have, the more normal they look to you. So you're normalizing unresearched, poorly justified beliefs as being, good beliefs to accept. And so he says this permanently, slowly changes your character. You become more gullible. You become less of a natural critical thinker. You get more enthralled to these bad ideas, right? And yes, they could. One badness is that collection of beliefs could explode into overt action. But even if it doesn't, it's making you more prone to collecting more and more of these wacky beliefs. And as that goes on, it's almost inevitably going to explode into overt action. And in other quotes around here, he says, look, even if you don't, the fact that you might even tolerate these beliefs in yourself or in other people is changing society's character to be more gullible, to be less skeptical of outlandish claims, to believe things on insufficient evidence, things like that. And that certainly, eventually, is going to have society commit some overt actions that will be influenced by those poorly justified beliefs. That will be bad, right? So this is why Clifford is so anal about that one white lie that you told yourself, right? So even if the ship owner's ship survives the trip, the real problem that Clifford has is not even so much that the ship owner lied to himself, but that the ship owner, that doing that makes the ship owner more likely to lie to himself in the future and to tolerate instances of other people lying to themselves out there in the society to make him more tolerant of that too. And he thinks there's kind of a little slippery slope here. If people get more tolerant of their gullibility, if they get more tolerant of other people's gullibility and poor thinking habits, then we're going to be gaining momentum such that we're going to lose all the things that previous generations have given us in all those libraries, including, most importantly, the capacity to fill more libraries through careful thought and evidence collection and those kind of things. So he thinks we got to be super anal to stop that from happening, because we're easy to corrupt. Now, one of the questions that I usually get in readings, in this reading, is that he does set the bar super high here, right? He says, look, you can't just decide to believe stuff for any old reason. You need to have evidence, and that evidence needs to be sufficient to justify the belief. So one of the common questions I get is, like, how much evidence is he talking about? He says question everything to make sure that I'm not fooling myself or allowing other people to fool me, right? And no belief is too small to care about. I got to question all those too. There's not enough hours in the day. What am I supposed to do here, right? And I need to act, right? You and I, real people in the real world, we don't have time to collect all the information before acting. So I'll give a real world example. The COVID pandemic, you had health officials having to recommend that the executive branch made some pretty consequential decisions, right? And they certainly didn't have all the information at hand. But clearly it wasn't an option for them to say, hey, whoa, we don't know enough, come back to us in a year and we'll tell you how to handle this pandemic. Because they had to handle it then. So they had to do the best they could. Well, what's the best they could? What does that mean for Clifford? How much evidence do they need to collect before they can pass judgment? And for Clifford, I think it's really important. He's not really talking about that kind of scenario maybe that we were in the pandemic. Because operating under conditions of uncertainty is a lot different than his examples. His examples of the ship owner and the conspirators were that they were avoiding evidence. They were avoiding things that would really actually serve to properly justify or throw out beliefs that they held. That they were deliberately, happily making themselves ill-informed and staying in an ill-informed state, even when they had the opportunity to get out. And most people think that most of those involved in the COVID pandemic reaction and management weren't being those kind of people. If they were being those kind of people, then Clifford would definitely agree with you. Those people deserve a ton of blame and shame and all sorts of stuff. But if they were making decisions that were not certain in an environment of uncertainty, sometimes you have to make decisions with incomplete information. It's still, in those cases, important not to avoid any available evidence, not to deliberately misinform yourself, but making the wrong decision, a decision that turns out to be wrong, because you didn't have all the information that you would have needed to make an ideal decision. Remember, Clifford's a deontologist, intentions matter. So the fact that certain decisions the CDC made turned out poorly, Clifford's ready to let that slide. If they made those decisions with bad intentions or with being overly gullible or influenceable by things that they shouldn't have been influenced by, that's where they deserve blame, says Clifford. Right? And so Clifford's overall point here is, if you're operating in uncertainty, make the best decisions you can with the evidence you have at hand at the point that you have to make the decision. So delay the decision if you can, if you're waiting for some relevant information to come in. But if you have to make the decision, make it on the basis of the information you have, but be prepared to change your mind if new stuff comes in. Keep paying attention to the facts. Follow the facts. If the facts now kind of suddenly lead you to think, I made the wrong decision, then you should correct that. You should change that decision, or you should try and repair it. You shouldn't just ignore it and forge on because you want to be consistent and not perceived to be a flip-flopper or something like that. So that's Clifford's opinion. Again, you don't have to agree with it, but that's his perspective here. And I think that what he's saying, what he's advocating for here, is a large component of what it means to be a responsible, critical thinker. It's kind of hard for me to imagine someone making a credible case that they're a critical thinker and not doing the stuff that Clifford thinks is important. So that's how this particular reading, that's why I chose this one to be first, both because it's relatively accessible, even though it was written in like the 1700s and it's got that kind of stilted Old English style. It's got some vivid examples, so I'm easing you into this stuff. But it also, in terms of its content, gives us a good basis to read the other readings and to learn the other stuff that we're going to learn in the course, because he's giving a philosophical perspective on critical thinking, how he thinks we should be responsibly rational in how we become persuaded to believe that there's better or worse ways to become persuaded of what we believe, right? And that, in a nutshell, that's what it means to be a critical thinker, is to think about that, to evaluate our belief forming procedures and processes, to see, hey, are those the best ones? Could I behave better in this area of my life, right? And some of the other readings we're going to do are also going to be philosophy oriented, like Clifford, and they're going to address this same problem just kind of from different directions or different aspects of it. But we're also going to have readings that are going to be from psychology. And the psychological perspective is going to be a little bit different. Instead of taking a look at what the ideal is on what critical thinking means, what's kind of required to be a critical thinker, psychologists are more interested in the real world, how close we approach that ideal, and are there any circumstances, any scenarios where we're particularly bad or particularly good at being responsibly rational. And so the psychological readings that I'm going to ask you to read for this course are going to explore different aspects of that question and talk about different ways in which we fail to be rational, in different ways in which we become a ship owner or a conspirator, and maybe have some lessons in there about how to avoid being put into circumstances that would turn us into ship owners or conspirators. All right, that concludes this lecture. What's next? Well, after you have watched this, hopefully you've asked some questions. Maybe you want to let it percolate for a while, but it's a 3-week course. You don't have much time to do that. You should have watched this after doing the reading, gone through the reading a couple times and posted some things there. Of course, you don't have to, right? But you can do these in any order you like, and you should try and figure it out. And maybe it's read the reading a time or two, watch this lecture, take the quiz, revisit the reading and the lecture, or maybe it's do the quiz and then do the other thing. You get to decide what you think will work the best, right? The only thing I wanted to say is, after you do any of these things, you're allowed to go to the other things and do more. And in some of the quizzes, it varies. I let you retake them. So maybe you want to take it once, see what kind of score you got, and then go back and do some more reading or rewatch this video and then retake the quiz. Or maybe it's not worth your time because it's only a point and you want to just move on. That's fine too. And what you should be doing now after that is that you should be starting on that next reading, or having more than one iron in the fire and starting on the introductory listicle tutorial module. All right? So go off and do those things.